Good evening and welcome to this special evening at the BAC. I'm Karen Nelson. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture. Thank you so much for joining us on the very last day of October at the BAC. It's my pleasure to co-host this lecture series with Yufan Gao, faculty member in landscape architecture, whom I'll introduce shortly. We're in Casheri Hall, named after our long-serving dean, Arcangelo Casheri, whose journey from Italy to Boston transformed this institution from club to center, and we took it from there to college. Tonight's lecture is the significant event of the year, and we are so grateful to CBT Architects for making that possible. Thank you so much. Hood Studio, the Shafran Hames Foundation, and Marianne Thompson Architects generously supported the complimentary exhibit that you saw on your way into the BAC, which is in McCormick Gallery downstairs. Thank all of you. That was so helpful. Before I share some background on the Morris Childs Memorial Lecture this evening, I'd like to give you an overview of tonight's events and what to expect tomorrow in the gallery if you're able to join us. First, I'll briefly introduce a new generation of designers to the work of Morris Childs. After that, I'll invite Yufan Gao to the podium to introduce our special lecturer, Walter Hood. After the lecture, we'll head to the gallery where BAC President Mahesh Das will introduce the Italian Consul General, Arnaldo Minuti. Following their remarks, we'll briefly hear from Walter Hood. Some of you may have already explored Natives, the exhibit downstairs, which features work, of course, by Hood Studio. That is the primary focus, but it also has work by 40 of our Summer Academy Urban Design Planning Fellows in it. And that group of students were so deeply engaged with the themes and ideas, and it transformed them, and it inspired them to change Upham's Corner in Boston to reflect the ideas of belonging and community that are in Walter Hood's work. So tomorrow, some of those students will be attending a 90-minute workshop with Walter Hood, then they'll have lunch, and then a second workshop will take place with BAC students. There are still spaces for that if you're interested. Now let me provide a little background on Morris Childs. He was a graduate of Amherst College, a distinguished architect and preservationist. Here's one of his many beautiful sketches of Italy on his travels. He was widely respected for his architectural work, including projects such as the Montshire Museum of Science in Vermont and the Nike Town building on Newbury Street in Boston's Back Bay, among many, many others. In 1996, he was named a Fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Here, I've shared some of Morris Childs' beautiful artwork and sketches along examples of his professional work. And you can also see all of the Childs lectures since 2017. Share this. And now I'd like to welcome Yufan Gao to the podium.
Thank you, Karen, for that warm introduction and for setting the stage for this evening's special event. It's my honor to join you all here today for this year's Childs Memorial Lecture. And good evening, everyone. My name is Yufan Gao. I'm a core faculty in the School of Landscape Architecture here at the Morris Childs Memorial Lecture offers us an opportunity to explore evolving intersections of disciplines at the BAC, where we educate a diverse student body and advance social equity through the design of landscape, architecture, interior spaces, sustainable environment, historic preservation, and spaces for human health. It's truly my privilege this evening to introduce our distinguished speaker, Walter Hood. Walter Hood is a multidisciplinary designer from Charlotte, North Carolina, globally recognized for his contribution in art, landscape architecture, urbanism, and research. Founding Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California in 1992, he now leads as a design creative director. Walter's academic journey began at North Carolina A&T State University
Like this, you just
in
mute.
architectural engineering.
Mic
He then transitioned to their pioneering landscape architecture program, graduating in his first class in 1981. Further study led him to the University of California, Berkeley. His passion for landscape and urbanism emerged from his broad democratic scope, allowing experiences beyond architectural constraints. Infusing African-American cultural arts into his philosophy, he established a unique voice, reshaping spaces to reflect contemporary needs without erasing their history. A professor at UC Berkeley and former educator at Harvard, Walter penned Black Landscapes Matter and has received accolades like the 2019 MacArthur Fellowship, 2021 Architectural League's Presidential Medal Award, and 2023 Wall Street Journal Innovator Award. This evening's lecture is accompanied by an exhibit downstairs named Natives, a traveling exhibit originally created in response to Leslie Loco's call for the 2023 Venice Biennale to center Africa and African diaspora in conversation about our constructed environments. Through the exhibit and the lecture, Walter Hood probes how landscape inform our notions of identity and belonging. This evening, he will explore the rich heritage of Phillips Gullah Geechee community of Charleston, South Carolina, and his profound connection to low country landscape at the International African American Museum. He will also delve into the community's history, cultural significance, and enduring legacy within a broader narrative of African American experiences and contribution in this unique region. Now it's with my great enthusiasm to invite you all to join me in welcome Walter Hood.
Good evening, everyone. How's everyone? Happy Halloween. I did not know I would be lecturing on Halloween, but I'm glad you guys dressed up for the occasion. It's a pleasure to be back in Boston and particularly at the BAC. I think I've had relationships with the college for probably over the last 20 years, and I've really enjoyed the students. And I've come into contact with probably a half a dozen students just all over, and I just have to compliment you guys. You educate your students very well. So bravo. Tonight, I'd like to share with you, I'm making it bigger. What's the clicker?
It's just the forward.
Okay.
Sometimes.
It went faster. All the way back. Okay, let me stop there. Tonight, I'd like to share with you a kind of a journey. This is the African American Ancestors Garden. This is a new book by Monticelli, which will be out December 1st. So you can go on Amazon right now and get it. But it's a work over the last 4 years when we were working on the International African American Museum with Harry Cobb in Charleston. The museum didn't have a director, and I had just received the MacArthur Award, and I thought that it would be a great gift for the museum for us to make a book. And the book, we have about a dozen authors, historians, local artists, just talking about the Low Country, and this is our gift back to the museum. But it also chronicles our relationship with Pay Cobb and Free. As you guys know, Harry Cobb passed away in 2020, but a wonderful relationship with him is also cataloged as well in the book. Thinking about the exhibit downstairs, Natives, and the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm a native of North Carolina, I wanted to kind of weave together a story that talks about how I actually came to design this garden, but where some of the ideas came from. And for students who are here, design is, for me, it's not a very rational and straightforward process. Things happen, right? You can be walking down the street and a car almost runs you over and an idea happens. Or you make something and no one wants it. And then 10 years later, everybody wants it. And so this idea of like making, it's about making and keeping and not throwing anything away because you never know who might need it or when someone might need it. It's also a wonderful time right now. The museum has been open now for over a year. And it has been a place where people can actually go and learn about their past. It's not like the museum on the mall that has everything from slave ships to basketball players. It basically deals with the Low Country, deals with Africa and the diaspora, and particularly Charleston. If you don't know anything about Charleston, Charleston rewrote its history at the turn of the previous century and basically said, we have to rewrite our history because we don't want to be known as a slave city. And so they basically, slaves became servants. And before you knew it, Charleston became the oldest city in the country, which it's not, but they rewove a different story so people could come. And that's why when we say, well, why are people getting married in plantations? It's because of the narrative that was set in this landscape. When Leslie Loco asked me to come to Venice to do a piece on natives, I immediately thought about my relationship back to Charleston. And this idea of how could I talk about, when I say the international diaspora. I've spent time in Italy. I've spent time all over the world, but I spent a lot of time in Italy at the American Academy, Florence, as well as Northern Italy. And when she asked me to come to Venice, I was like, wow, I have to figure out the time that I spent there. How am I native to that place as well as native to America? And when I talk about native, it's like being from a place and having connections. And so 6 years ago at the Chicago Biennale, there was an article written about Obama building a library and cutting down trees in Washington and Jefferson Park. And I was asked to do an installation, and I was reading this paper one day, and I was like, wow, Jefferson, Washington, aren't they presidents? So they got parks. Obama is a president, so why, they didn't even mention that. So we went and collected the wood, and we actually made 3 trees. And one's Washington, one's Jefferson, and one's Obama. And that was sort of the first time this idea of working with wood, particularly this material. And years before, I was at the Rauschenberg Institute down in Florida, and I was making these little wood models looking at palm trees and how palm trees grow. So that stuck in my head. So when I got the wood, I then started to stack the wood for this piece. And again, that stayed with me for a while. And then when we started working in Phillips, which is this Gullah Geechee community, they make baskets. And so I started thinking about the woven pieces of wood that we had made and how now through sweetgrass baskets, all of these things are interconnected, right? The hands using native materials, resources at hand that you can actually build art from. And that became this project of natives, of trying to say within this community of Phillips, which is in South Carolina, Phillips is down below. People live amongst the overgrown. And that's the way they talk. They're like, if I need to have a patch for my daughter, I just cut a little bit of the overgrown and I put our house there. But we don't do what those guys do up there, which is basically take out all the weeds and cut the grass. They just live in a different way. They live amongst the landscape. And when we worked there, that resonated with me so much that we wanted to bring them actually to Charleston. And so through this design work, did my slides turn sideways? Through this design work, we actually began to sort of weave together this story of natives, this idea that living amongst the overgrown, you actually can come in and actually reuse the wood when it's time actually to rebuild. And through that building, you actually get this art that ties directly back to basket making, but also to this low country landscape. And in Phillips, Richard Habersham said something to me one day, he said, Walter, When my ancestors were freed from the plantation here, we thought all we had to do was own land. And what they found out over time is you also have to pay taxes, right? And of course, those suburbs around Phillips, right, are built on top of plantations. The exact plat of the plantations. And of course, that land is worth a lot of money once they drain the swamps. And so the taxes of Phillips has gone up, which has literally created this gentrifying scheme. And working with them, we actually created a Lifeways plan, which then gave them a plan they could take to the county. I think 2 years ago, they're now on the National Register, and they are not, how can I say, right now, they're not going to be plowed over by a main road. But through this work, we were able to really think about, well, what does it mean, right, to live in native places? And as we were researching these basket houses, we were also looking to Italy. And what we found out in Venice was that very early in Venice, they found that there was this wood there, the chestnut tree. And that by creating these plantations, when you put the chestnut in water, it actually became like concrete. And so Venice is actually sitting on stilts of this wood. And so thinking about the two, that became the genesis of these relationships. And so this proposal for Phillips tries to, can I say, remedy the basket houses that have been taken off the main road through the standardization of the road. When they put curbs and gutters on the main road, therefore, the basket houses that you can just pull off informally could no longer go there. And they put them in one place where you have to go into a parking lot. And of course, the basket sales have dropped. And so this idea would be bringing the baskets back to the community, and people could walk along this walkway, and you could actually buy and sell your baskets and other things while visiting this landscape. And when we completed this, we wanted to carry it over to Venice, and I needed a connection. And the connection that I found was, I think it's called Meeting at the Rialto. And at that painting, there are pictures of 3 Moors. Moors are actually carrying the wood. And doing the research, I found that they were not, slaves who were mooring boats, but they were house slaves. And so they were dressed in a very different way. And so we actually made scrim of them and placed them there. Now, this is like probably the best project of my life because I get to work in the grounds of Carlos Scarpa. Right? And so when Leslie asked me, do you want to do the courtyard? I was like, sure. And to work, with Scarpa, it was very interesting. And you can kind of note that there are some certain things like we didn't touch anything. Like the column goes about an inch from it. And so it kind of respects the pavilion, but we turned the pavilion into a wetland. So walking into the pavilion, you felt like you were actually in a swamp. And in the heat, in the summertime in Venice, it felt just like you were in Charleston. Right? And having the wood, the palmettos, it actually created this one-to-one, which was really fantastic. It's thinking about how one might think of working in one place and then going to another place and actually enmeshing yourself in that same environment, but having the same connection between the two. And again, it's not a literal connection, but it's one that's tied right to that infrastructure, but also to a way of living. And so my argument was the way the Venetians live on the water, right, with this resource that's local. There's an island that they make boats on. Everything is there. And so when you need it, doing the Aqua Alto, they basically have this warehouse where they go out and they have platforms. So if you've been to Venice in September, they just bring them out. And so we asked, can we use some of the Aqua Alto platforms? And they came out and made us perfect ramps and walkways that you see right here. We're hoping that this exhibit travels not only at BAC, but travels to other places as well. Tonight, I would like to spend most of the time talking about Charleston, and particularly the creation of a garden in Charleston, and how did we arrive at this place in time. Charleston is known as the neck. You can kind of see it. It looks like a snake, right? And there are these 2 rivers that come up. And along those rivers, that's where the plantations were built. Very early in the swamp land, they tried to grow rice, and to no avail. They just didn't know how to move the waters. And with enslaved people coming from West Africa, they figured out that they found rice field Negroes, is the way the pamphlet was. These are West Africans who know how to move rice, right, through these beautiful sloughs and canals, but also knows how to propagate rice production. And I think I read somewhere during the first year of the enslaved coming here, rice production was like 300%, right, because it was failing before, and all of a sudden through that ingenuity. The other thing I want to talk about is this idea of lost sites. The site for the International African American Museum is located right next to the aquarium, but between two condominiums. The first design was actually located there in the parking lot. And it was being designed by Antoine Pradock. And Mayor Riley, who's one of the longest term mayors in the country, thought that the site was perfect. It had a garage on the backside. And it was actually really close to the aquarium. The project never went anywhere. They couldn't get any fundraising. And then the mayor hired Harry Cowell. And Harry came to the site. This is what Harry told me. And he said, Mr. Mayor, you should not put the museum up against a garage. It should be on the water. This thing deserves more respect on the water. And he says, let's walk down the street. And he walked down the street. And he saw the site right here. And it was a park, just a park with a walkway there. And he said, what about this site? And the mayor said, oh, we're about to sell it for a restaurant, but we can close the deal today. And they closed the deal. I want to say within a year, an article came out called Gadsden's Wharf. And it talked about they found the site of the old wharf of Gadsden. And it's interesting that they found it because the park across the street is called Gadsden's Park. Right? But they found the site, and this was the site of one of the largest warehouses for the enslaved in North America. And that they believe upwards to 45% of the slave African diaspora landed there. And so when we were hired, we said, can we do the archaeology? As soon as we did the archaeology, we actually found the remains of the warehouse, and they actually found other remains of mittens and other things there. And so we know that that's the actual site. And so I give you that story because, you know, this is America. This story is happening every day, right? Someone's wanting to build something. Someone goes, I think something was over there. And someone like writes a paper. Before you know it, we're discovering something, and it's all there. And I think Lonnie Bunch says it's all in plain view. If we look at it, we can step on that history everywhere you go. Here's the map. And again, this was not lost. After reading the article, I then went to a lot of stores throughout Charleston. You can buy these beautiful history maps. And there it is right there, Gadsden, right? It's right there in plain view. But someone had to say what it was. And you can kind of see where the warehouses were, the little thin strip there. And there are stories and accounts of the enslaved dying, perishing here, because slaves were brought out to Fort Moultrie, dropped off, incubated, then shipped across the harbor and put in this warehouse until there was time to sell. And you could imagine the heat, the dankness of that. And there are stories of the food chain in the harbor actually changed, that sharks were actually feeding closer. And so one cannot imagine what that would be like. And that whole history is buried underground. And every time I go to the site while we were working, I'm always thinking there are people out walking their dogs over the site, right? And then all of a sudden they're going to know this history. And it's been interesting having conversations with people, right, who have used the site in a kind of ordinary way, and all of a sudden come back. And all of a sudden they go like, wow, this has been there all along. While starting the project, again, I was influenced by Toni Morrison's work. I had a chance to meet Toni while I was in graduate school. Me and her son was in architectural school together. And the first thing she said to me when I met her, she goes, you boys, how are we going to change the world? And of course, I was just like, nothing, right? But then coming back, 25 years later and reading her quotation and her project, A Bench by the Road, where after she wrote Beloved, she wrote this quote. And she said, there's no place for me to sit and think about my ancestors. And she's placed benches now in places of the African diaspora, not only in North America, but in Europe. And these are just standard metal benches. that they placed down, and there's a little plaque beside it. But that work to me was like really powerful. And so as we started, I wanted to get people together and go around the Low Country. So about 25 of us, historians, politicians, planners, designers, city people, we went to Middleton Place, which is Middleton Plantation, one of the first colonial gardens I learned about in landscape architecture school. And we walked around and we talked about what does it mean, right, to tell the story of the Low Country. They're finally telling the story beyond the fields. This is the first exhibit that they actually admit that enslaved people were here. We have the first names. It's in one room only. But just walking around, you get this feeling, that there's a landscape that our ancestors inherited and made. We then went out to Fort Moultrie. These are the pest houses that were located out at the edge. And there's a small, meager exhibit in the back, which I was also taken by. I think the exhibition space was probably half the size of this room, where most of the history was about the Civil War, right? And about, I don't know, baskets and ships and stuff, but this was back in the small vitrine. And I was taken by, again, the Ricefield Negro pamphlet, but also the images of shackles and chains and the badges. I didn't know that in Charleston you could rent out your slaves. It's one of the few places you could rent out your slaves, and you had to wear a badge. Yeah. And if you were caught without your badge, you were taken away, but you had to wear the badge, and the badges actually said what it is you do. So if you were a baker, if you were a blacksmith, that basically said your occupation. And I was taken by this cartoon, which seemed like it was like someone had Xeroxed a piece of paper, but it stayed with me on my phone because it looked like a piece of textile, African textile. And I would later see that it's actually part of the Brooks map, redrawn. But the bigger thing that occurred to us, me while we were there, this is Michael Allen, who worked for 25 years for the Park Service. And in 20 years, he was able to get a sign out there in the Park Service that said, Sullivan's Island. And it told this story. 20 years it took him, and then he retired. Right? But we're standing here by a bench by the road. And the whole time we're out there, this is the only thing people took pictures of. This is the only thing. And this is Toni Morrison's bench and Toni Morrison's quote. Here we are at Fort Moultrie, at the edge, right, of the Atlantic. And that's the thing that everybody is taking photos. And it kind of like hit me like a tidal wave that we need better ways to talk about like these places that we're in, so that we can have, I would say, multiple ways to experience, but multiple ways to tell our story. And then lastly, we went through some of the Gullah Geechee communities and talked to different people. I talked about Phillips, Canyonville, 6 Miles, and these are all settlements that were built on top of plantations and were deeded over to the free enslaved people. And then lastly, we met at Mother Emanuel. And this was literally a month after the shooting that took place here, in the massacre that took place here, and we had prayer. But from that, we were able to start to build a vocabulary of things and ways to talk. And with our 25 to 30 people, we sat in a room, and I came up with 21 concepts that was based on those 3 days. I'm gonna go through these fairly quickly. But these concepts were things that we talked about, and I wanted to have discussions, particularly with the elder, to see how far we could push, right, the visual and experiential quality of what we experienced. And some of these are just pretty simple, Middle Passage, Tabby, the Fleet, a pier, bricks, but really thinking about light, thinking about the ground, thinking about spirituality. And so our first idea was a hologram. What if we had hologram projections, because Harry had designed these columns to be 2 meters wide? And what if when you came in that you actually saw your ancestors on the columns? Of course, the elderly people were like, we don't want to see any ghosts projected on buildings. Broken chains. We wanted to like hang the chains from the soffit, right? And then cut them at the horizon. And then at night, maybe they would become something completely different. So this idea of emancipation. Or more projections. What if we projected from the roof outward into the harbor? and actually had our ancestors coming up out of the water in which they were actually taking the bondage. And of course, the city was like, you cannot shoot jets of water up in the harbor. Okay. The cloud and still I rise. What if we took corpses and stacked them and put them and made a roof of corpses that you had to walk underneath? And again, the elder people was like, Mr. Hood, I don't have to say anymore. Clouds and figures. The soffit is about a football field long. And we thought, well, what if we had the form of these bodies on the actual ceiling? And we made them white so that you didn't know what you were seeing. And then you came up very close to them and understood what they were. Or what if we had 1,000 steles where some of the older people talked about the rocks in the low country and the rocks having spirits? And what if those became an annotation for the quantity of people that came in through? But what if we just remember, right, just through the ground plane? So we thought about just flooding the ground. So every hour a bell would chime and the entire ground would flood with water. And the water would like be cascading all the way underneath the building. The architects were like, we need to use this underneath space to get inside the building. And tabby. Tabby is a form created by the enslaved, which is using the shale from the ocean, mixing in with cement that creates a paved surfaces. You can make architecture as well, all the way down to St. Aug. You can find this manifestation. But what if we made these mountains and again, created this field of tabby? Or what if we took brick and made vertical towers? Or what if we said, okay, no landscape, we just need a boat. Let's take a boat, take us out to Sullivan's Island and back, that's all we need. Or what if we made a pier that no longer took in the commissions from the National Park Service, but actually talked about going back and forth to Sullivan's Island? And what if we went to Bunch Island and got big rocks and brought them back? Or what if we created a place that we can leave offerings, where people could actually light a candle, have some fire, have some spirituality under the building. And then during the day, people would actually collect, and at night, the place would become a different place. Or what if the badges, if we asked President then Obama and Michelle to actually have their badges made, and any other person of African descent would get their badges made. So we would have badges of a president, of a first lady, of a professor, also with a cook, a blacksmith, all the people before us. And those chains will become columns. And this was a curatorial nightmare. The museum was like, who's gonna like collect all of these things? Or what if we shaped the ground and flooded the ground and actually grew rice? Or brick passages, when you walk around Charleston, you actually come into contact with the hands of kids in the brickwork. But what if we made the ground in a different way or made towers? Or what if we created topography, pulled the brick up and allowed you to go under the brick? And once you went under, maybe then that was a time that you could actually, again, have process and have a place for restoration. And out of that came 4 significant sort of projects. And we basically work in this iterative way where each one of those 4 concepts then were merged together and they became a single idea. And so this one was about, again, lifting the ground up and having this kind of pregnant pause that happens and one goes in. And of course, the city couldn't do this because the code in Charleston says at the waterfront, you have to be able to see the water. You cannot block the water. So that killed this immediately. Clouds and figures, again, taking the entire underneath of the building and flooding it and having the ceiling and the ground filled with bodies. And so you're actually working between this, if you, the soffit just came up and actually left the marks. And then when it drained, you actually saw the figures. And then at night, the silhouettes would actually play out in the harbor. Badges, steles, and chains, taking all of these objects and bringing them together to create one underfoot. And working through these projects with the community, what was really wonderful was having people comment on how much they could take, right, of pain. And we talked a lot about in African-American culture, this dialectic of pain and joy, right? That when I grew up, it's like, there was always a funeral in the neighborhood. So you would go to a wake, and after that, you ate and drank, right? But there was always this moment where there was a time to be sad, but there was also a time to be happy. And we talked a lot about that, like in this one place in the warehouse, we wanted to have like 100 figures and people thought that was going to be too much, right? And so by the time we got to the design, it became very clear that chains, that people didn't want one representational figures, right? They didn't want the same thing, an African with a chain and a ball that you see in most places. They also didn't want, let's say, art just coming in and being plopped down, because of course, as soon as people heard about the museum, everybody's sending their art. We just wanted it literally the underneath to be almost like the sea. So imagine if you could go down to the bottom of the sea and just see the tabby in this piece growing up. And out of that came the plan that was very simple. To the north, we would tell the story through planting of the low country, and to the south would be much more about the people who died here and perished. And then the underneath is a place for celebration, but it's also a place for programming. And that's so that middle space is empty intentionally. And then the other piece at night, we wanted no fences around. So currently there's no fences around, there's just bollards. If you walk around Charleston, there are ghost tours that you can take and go through cemeteries and other places. And we want this to feel the same way. If you're seeing the ghosts in the cemetery, you're seeing the ghosts of our ancestors here. The building is very simple, as I said, it's about a football field long. We marked where the edge of the shore used to be and the warehouse. And here you can kind of see the tabby and the columns and how it becomes one simple composition together. And again, this is a hurricane location, so the buildings have to be up. But I think what Harry did really wonderful was the columns, they peter out at the top. And it says if the building kind of floats. And then the columns are made of tabby as well. So imagine the floor coming up and becoming the actual columns itself. And then this notion of the fountain at the end. We know we're 7 feet up from the high tide. And so we created this infinity fountain to give this almost illusion that the water is coming and moving under the building. And then looking at the real Brooks map, really trying to say, we don't want pedagogically to tell this story per se. The story is being told in the museum. But we wanted the ground to kind of hint that there's something underfoot. And so this is a museum after it's built. You can kind of see that long bar, how it creates the shade underneath. But also it's a very simple configuration. You arrive in the middle and you move out into two ends. It's intentional. One, the family center looks back to Charleston with the white steeples, where the museum itself looks out to the Atlantic with a cross. And the exhibits are, some are permanent and some are constantly changing. And you can actually go outside. It's one of the few museums you can actually be in the museum, open a door and go on the porch, right? Which is really wonderful because you're in Charleston, right? That air conditioned air, and you go out into that heat and come back in. Yeah, it's really powerful. And that centerpiece is meant to be ceremonial so that you can have program on both sides. And this is one view I love. The architects are so anal, which I love. That each one of those rails corresponds to a joint in the brick. I mean, I think it's one, Hitochi took him a year to detail that brick. Well, moving to the landscape, as you come from the city, we wanted to, again, thinking about some of the ideas, we wanted to agitate the ground. So it felt like, there was a primary dune here at one time. These are 7 feet tall. And what they do, they create a very different edge for the building, but they actually bring the scale of that 13 feet down because they're 7 feet tall. And you make your way not on axes, but into the underside of the building. When you look back, it then takes away that middle ground and brings Gadsden's Park towards you. The park is directly across, and so it looks bigger than it actually is. There's an ethnobotanical garden along this edge. Unsaid in the whole project, there's a small building to my left here. It's a pumping station. And that little pumping station is pumping out all the water after it rains in Charleston. So it's kind of interesting that we have this cultural institution and this piece of infrastructure right there, right? That are working together. Here you're looking at the Stele Garden and then working your way back on the outside This makes your way back out to the fountain. But the site is a choreographed site. Like I said, to the north, it's all really about being in that lush landscape of the South. Oak trees, sweet grass, and smaller perennials that we know the enslaved brought with them. And one can find their way and make their way through that small landscape. There are these small installations that talk about the badges, and they actually make places where people can actually go and sit and actually get away from the large crowds. But they also provide respite and shadow and sun. But the bigger piece along the front is the fountain itself. And this is, you can sort of see how these were taken from that cartoon. And the fountain basically fills up from the center and drains back out. It gurgles, it makes noise. There's a script along the edge that talks about all the different communities that the enslaved came from as you're looking back out. And one thing I didn't expect was the reflectivity, which I could not imagine, because it's facing east. And so as the morning sun comes in and sets, it changes drastically every moment of the day. But what we wanted was, when it drained out, for the bodies actually to have puddles. And the puddles with the shells kind of create that moment, right? That moment where the seabed, right, is tied to the shore, it's tied to the figure of the body. And as you move around, again, the reflections, it changes that edge in ways that, again, I could not have imagined. And I was showing you one of the designs that had bodies on the soffit. The reflections actually reflect the bodies on the soffit itself, which again, we didn't design, but it actually manifests itself. The first day I went and visited the museum, there was a security guard standing out by the fountain, and I was looking down, and he says, "Mister, do you know what that is?" I said, "No." He said, "You want me to tell you?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Those are the bones of our ancestors." Wow, that's pretty cool. And every docent I talk to has a different interpretation. And I talking to the director, she was like, "I like that." And so there are no signs. I think they're just little labels that tell you what they are, but there's no interpretation that says you're supposed to act this way. And there's just been some really interesting experiences happening. Like one day I'm there are two kids that went running into the fountain. That's what kids do, right? And the parents just went up and said, "No, come on back." Then another couple were going out on a boat. It's a white couple. They had two kids with them. They didn't know anything about the museum. They were going to take a boat out to Fort Moultrie, like they do. The tourists go out to the edge, and they were walking by, and I could see, what are these people doing? They go and they queue. The wife comes back. She's got her phone, and she's kind of taking pictures. She goes back to the husband. She shows the picture. He scratches his head. He didn't go. And they didn't go on their tour, and they actually came to the museum. But it's that kind of, I think, conversation that's happening. Because again, it's not like there's a big sign that says, "This is the International African American Museum." It's a place along the shore of Charleston. But again, for me, the beauty of it is seeing people actually having a place to think about their ancestors. Right? When you think, if there's no other place in the city, everything else is built to the Confederacy. And to see people move around in different ways, it's just really delightful. School groups come out, sit along the edge, and reflect and look back out. And then during sunset, it becomes a wetland. It looks like a marsh because the light literally breaks down. And all of a sudden, you have this natural element that's actually becoming more and more abstract. And as you move outward into the landscape, you start to see the handwork of different artisans. We were able to work with a family of brick masons, father and son. And the contractor said, "Mr. Brick, we can't make a curvy wall that thin." And they were like, "Yes, we can." And he was like, "I think there's one like that in Virginia somewhere." And he brings me a picture of UVA. Awesome. But having these juxtapositions of material and ground really create just a different world at the edge. And then lastly, at the warehouse, where it's at the furthest southern edge, you can kind of see the boundary there. There's a set of palm trees. It looks back out to the Atlantic. there's a wall, and along that wall, Maya Angelou talks about, I rise, I rise. And then as you go around the other side, we create a gauntlet. And this gauntlet is, we were having this long conversation with historians about when the enslaved were here in the warehouse, they were neither African or American, but they were in that state. And so we talked a lot about abstraction. And should these be kind of almost like lumps of material that looks like they're becoming? And there was long conversation on which way should they face? Should they face towards the sea or the city? And then the walls are reflected. So as you walk through, they reflect yourself as well. But again, you know, projects like this try to weave together narratives, not only, right, of America, North America, but also places afar. When I thought of this piece, I thought about Egypt. I thought of Rome. I thought of Cartouches, you know, and how people left behind their marks in history, you know, where the carving deep cuts into something. But I also thought of ruins, right? We don't like ruins in this country unless, you know, they're like some rich person's ruin, but we don't like ruins around for some reason. But ruins can tell stories, right? And so I'm hoping as this project ages, it could begin to tell a very different story. Thank you guys so much.
We have time for some questions, and we have a mic set up for those questions. Anybody want to ask anything? Yeah. Brandon, come on.
Thank you so much for your lecture. That was beautiful. My question is, was there any part of the project that was value engineered that you really wish had been included? And why? Thanks.
No. And for those who don't know what value engineering is, it's like, you know, you get to a place and it's like, Walter, you need to cut $5 million, or, you know, you have to take money out of it. But I have to say, there were areas that the city in the beginning wanted us to actually put in the city standards, right? Benches and stuff. And I was like, no way. And the mayor got behind us. And so we were able to, all the furniture you saw, again, all this was made locally. And we actually had donors actually pay for each of those things. So we literally took all the furniture out of the contract. And we literally created our own, working with fabricators, our own donor package. So that allowed the city, this is a city project, which is, again, you know, this is a public project. This is not a private nonprofit. So again, they have to maintain it like they maintain parks. And so that was the biggest battle, getting them to see the value of this not being like the park across the street. Hello.
Hey, Walter, thank you so much for presenting this. The level of detail in every aspect of this so clearly reflects the conversations that you had and the presence that you had with community. And I'm really interested in hearing you talk more about how and why you chose to so strongly center a deep process with community in the way that you develop this. 'Cause I think that's been a part of my evolution as a designer, is to do that more.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear about that.
I mean, I could talk about this all night, right? I mean, those of you who do public work, it occurred to me at one point, somewhere along the line in my career, that when you do the 3 schemes, right? You guys know what I mean? You do scheme A, scheme B, scheme C, and then you get the Post-its and you put them up. There's always someone who feels like they're losing, right? They come up after, it's like, I really want to C, and it's hard to get them to think about A. And I went to a think tank in Detroit maybe 12 years ago, and there was a sociologist, I think, who was talking about process. But she was talking about process with people and making decisions. And she was saying, you need to at least come up with a dozen ways of communicating before you might get to a new idea. Right? And she did this workshop with us. It was like, she just would set up these things. And it was like, okay, let's talk about dirt. Let's talk about buses, just these crazy things, but we did 12 of them. And we didn't know, but after 12, it was like this amazing moment where you just felt like you had thrown everything out and it was really, really hard to come up with new things. And that's when the conversation got great. And so in my studio, we started doing this matrix where on one side we would put the medium of landscape and on the other we would put whatever the program of the project is. And like it would be like light might be one of the things, light and sky. And then we might say death, right? So what would I say with light about death, right? The same thing would be the ground, geology, death. Same thing with vegetation, death. So it just forces you to look to the medium and try to understand it and how it can represent. Because one of the, I think the bigger issues, particularly in landscape architecture, is my students, they do this all the time. They get up and they talk for 15 minutes and nothing they're saying is on the wall. Right, they're talking about something and all I see on the wall is like 5 trees and a path. But they want to do everything else but the 5 trees and the path. And I keep telling them, we only have so much stuff. So really to interrogate the stuff, because this is what normal people do. Right? Someone dies, you plant a tree. But you have to think about what kind of tree to plant. Right. And so again, if we start to think about the medium that way, and so in all of our designs, we do this long thing where I think we're working in Jacksonville now, there's 32 different scenarios, right? To get people to kind of see the possibilities. And it helps to make original work. And I never have to look at Pinterest. That's the most beautiful thing. I don't think I've looked at Pinterest in years. I don't think I've even picked up a magazine in years. It helps, it gets you out of that, oh, I remember such and such did this, let me do that. It forces you to think about the originality. Or you would take a long time.
Hi, Walter. Thanks for the lovely presentation. I'm a practicing landscape architect, but also like to consider myself an artist. And when I've been in these firms, landscape architecture firms, when any of these opportunities for more artistic moments come up, the thing that I hear constantly is, we're not artists, we're architects. We need to bring in a consultant. We can't do, this is someone else's job. This is not our job. And the project you presented is such a blend of landscape design, landscape architecture, and sort of public art itself. How did you and your team negotiate and navigate sort of like the translation of the concepts that you brought into these pieces? And did you feel that you were able to sort of make these concepts into pieces of art yourself, or did you bring in consultants to kind of give advice on any of this? And kind of what was that process like?
I mean, everything you saw that's made was designed in the studio. The little models that I showed in the beginning, me and one of my assistants, a RISD grad, who was just like, could make models in her sleep. So I love RISD grads as well. But a lot of it happened in the studio. But the bigger thing is, this dichotomy between art and architecture, art and landscape. We have to stop creating this dichotomy, right? Artists work in different mediums, right? Landscape architects, we have our medium. As an architect, we have our medium. And it's just really looking at that medium, again, like I was just saying, and figuring out the artful way to use the medium. I think landscape architecture, we've given that up. We've given it up for years ago to Sweet's catalog and all those people in the back of Landscape Architecture magazine, right? I don't want someone else designing my bench or my garbage can or my light, because as a moment, I've lost stuff, right? Because if I'm choosing paving out of a catalog, if I'm choosing all this stuff, what's left? Trees, right? And so again, thinking about everything as something that it's possible to imbue it with beauty, life, history. I mean, all of that stuff. I mean, to see a brick with fingerprints in it, come on. How can you do paving the same way? Right? Because that tells a story. And so again, trying to find those moments where it happens. And you know, everything from the little figures to the benches, all of that is done in our studio. And it took a while for me to figure out that the kinds of projects that I wanted to work on had to involve all of my training as an urbanist, as an architect, as a landscape architect, and an artist, right? All of that training is going into that. And so I would say, you know, when they scoff at that, just say, make something beautiful and change their minds, right? I mean, I think that's one way of doing it, make something beautiful. And, you know, there are like a lot of good landscape architects who look at the medium, the material as the thing that should be present at the end of the day. Hopefully that answers your question.
Just want to make one comment. I just love the integration of your work, the architecture, the landscape, the artists, and then just the power of that integration. I'd love to see more of that. You know, we call them separate disciplines, but they really aren't. They really should be in concert. And what I liked about this project is just the absolute power of the integration. I don't know what it was like for you working with the architect, but it seemed like you were dancing together completely in rhythm by what we saw in the results. It's just absolutely stunning. It actually makes me want to go down there and photograph.
You should go and photograph. Well, I mean, Boston has a couple of Harry buildings here, right? I mean, the JFK courts. And I've heard Harry give lectures about that building, and it makes you cry. If you've never like read anything by Harry Cobb, I mean, he's really a wonderful architect. But I have to say, out of my years of practice, he's one of the few architects. He called me up and said, Walter, we need you. And then when we worked together, he was just like, everything underneath the building is yours. And when we would propose something, he's like, that's your idea. You know, it was not like we can't do that, you can't do that. And, you know, it is that kind of respect back and forth, because again, even with the building, there's a kind of, you know, for us, it's kind of a respect of that work as well, right? Of the soffit, of the columns, of the ground plane, all of that.
I used to be Steve Rosenthal, one of his assistants, and got the chance to photograph the numbers of this project.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question from online. Greg Blackburn would like to know if you always are making 21 schemes for every project, public or not.
This is what my principals always like. Do we always have to make 29 schemes? Like, yes. Like I said, right now we're working in Florida on a project, and there's 32. In Charlotte, we did an exhibition there. There was 27. Right? I mean, I don't know. I've always had this dream. I want to do 101 something. Right? Made of this, you know, I mean, 101 architectural fantasies always stuck with me when in architectural school. I always wanted to do 100 of things, but in a way, again, it's liberating actually to create that kind of multiplicitous ideas, but it's also, they're limited concepts. So they're not trying to do everything, right? They're just, you're becoming an expert at one thing, right? Which if you're trying to do 10 things, you never become an expert at one. And so just focusing on one thing actually liberates you from having to think about a lot of things together.
Hi, Walter. Thank you for the lecture. Amazing project. And my question is, how was the beginning of it integrated with Karen online question? Like, how was the beginning of it until you work your creativity to arrive in like doing 21 sketches, 21 schemes is gonna be the way that we are gonna arrive in something nice. Like, how was the beginning of it until you have that amazing result as you do have?
Well, hopefully I alluded to that, right? I mean, that's literally was the beginning. We got a van. We went out for 3 days. We talked. I literally was sketching. Those are little sketches in my sketchbook. I'm sketching on the airplane going back and forth, and then going to my studio with those little sketches and working them through. But it's more about, the bigger part is having that time and space where you can be impulsive. Right, I think it's Smithson who talks about the purity of impulse, but you know, you learn about something long enough, you don't make any, there's no action. You're just eating it, eating, and then you go. And so for us, those 3 days was one, but we do it in different ways. We just came back from Miami and we spent 2.5 days with the client, going to different places around Miami. Again, letting this stuff gestate before we even make it, and then come back with those ideas. So you do need that source. And I'm always looking for the source, and the source can't be the same thing. Right? Whether it's a tour of a neighborhood, whether it's a barbecue, one project, we collected photographs. So we're trying to come up with ways to engage people in their space, and then allowing for that feedback to happen in a way that is not as rational, right, as a lot of these community meetings we tend to do.